Hello, everybody, and welcome to First Tuesdays. First Tuesdays is a monthly webinar offered by the Washington State Library. And before we get started today, I have a little bit of business to attend to before I turn you over to our presenter. First of all, I am your facilitator. My name is Tammy Masonheimer, and here's my contact information. Today we have Jeremy Stroud for technical support. Hello, Jeremy. And Jeremy, can you please put your contact info into the chat in case someone needs your help? And we'll be also recording this webinar today, and it will be posted on the Washington State Library training page. So First Tuesdays are brought to you by the Washington State Library, which is part of the Office of Secretary of State. Our funder is the Institute of Museum and Library Services through the LSTA Act. So as a requirement of our funding, we are going to ask that you take a short 4-question survey that will appear when you close the window at the end of the presentation today. And it's important information that we include in our annual report to continue our funding for training such as this. And we thank you in advance for your feedback. And today we have a great presentation. It's really interesting things. I want to thank Kathleen Sullivan for taking the time today to present and to talk about open data. At Kathleen's request, we can take questions into chat at any time during the presentation, and she's willing to answer things as you have questions pop up. So Kathleen is the Open Data Literacy Consultant here at the Washington State Library. She earned her Master's of Library and Information Science at the University of Washington, where she focused on data and information literacy. Her previous 25 years of professional experience included government and financial journalism, as well as nonprofit fundraising, advocacy, and program development. So without further ado, I turn it over to Kathleen.
Thanks, Tammy. Good morning, everybody. I'm just going to take a moment here to share my screen and we'll get started. Okay, so I'm so glad you've joined this webinar to talk about open data and what libraries are doing with open data. And I'll start out by telling you a little bit about myself. So there you see a picture of your humble presenter. I am the Open Data Literacy Consultant at the State Library, and what that means is I support libraries across the state with open data activities. And when I say activities, I'm really talking about 3 big categories. One is libraries publishing open data about themselves, libraries teaching other people how to find and use open data, and libraries advising government about how to publish or improve their open data. So I am a pretty newly minted librarian. I just finished my MLIS at UW, but as Tammy said, I have a long history with information in the public interest. I was a journalist for about 10 years in government and economic reporting, both of which rely pretty heavily on public documents. And when I was working and doing nonprofit development and grant writing, any of you who has ever written a grant, you know that that involves marshaling a lot of data and often from public documents. So when I got to library school, I knew I was going to focus at least part of my degree on data and data literacy, and I did that along with data curation and a little bit of statistics and coding. I started work at the State Library this summer as an intern for the Open Data Literacy Project at UW's Information School, and now I'm working here to follow up on research I started then. So here's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to start with what open data is exactly, and then we will walk through a little gallery of open data sources and uses. We'll then turn to what libraries are doing with open data. And by then, I hope you will be so inspired that you will say, what can I do to get started or advance my open data activities? And I will have a few suggestions and a lot of resources for you to do that. As Tammy said, I am happy to take questions on a rolling basis. So if you have a question, just type it into the chat box and she will let me know and we will go from there. So it seems like every open data webinar or workshop has to start with the definition slide. So here is my definition slide, and this is a good one from Open Knowledge International. Open data can be freely used, modified, and shared for anyone, by anyone for any purpose. So when people talk about open data, in general, they're often talking about one of two big categories. They're talking about open data from scholarly research or open data that's generated and published by government agencies. So if you're an academic librarian, you may already be familiar with open data from scholarly research, open data that's published in the social sciences, astronomy, biology, and so on. That is very interesting and not the primary focus of my job. So the primary focus of my job is open government data, and particularly open government data published by local agencies in Washington state. So counties, cities, fire protection districts, health departments, and so on. And one last note that although open data in its broadest sense can mean text or other kinds of content, because data is any information that is evidence of something. When I talk about open data, I am basically talking about structured data. So data that can be processed by a computer. What that means is that when you grab that data, it is often going to open into something that looks like a table or a spreadsheet or into a map. Okay, so now you can all define open data on a quiz, but you're probably, some of you might still be saying, what is it? And so now we're just going to walk through a few examples so you can see what it is and how people use it. But before I start that up, I have a little poll. I would love to know just who's on the call and what your familiarity is with open data so far. So if you don't mind, just take a moment to tick one of those boxes and then we'll move on. Okay, so we're going to start with open data at the source. And what you see here are screenshots of open government data portals, open data portals from government sources, which is how, oh, that's interesting, which is how government data is often released. So on the right, you see data.gov, which is the US federal government's open data portal, which is just about to turn 10 years old. So you see, we're not talking about a super new information source. And in the middle, you see data.wa.gov, which is the gateway for Washington state's actually several data portals, including tabular data sets, geospatial data, and a few performance dashboards. And then over on the left, you see the city of Spokane's GIS data portal. And lots of counties and cities in Washington state have their own data portals. It's not just bigger cities like Spokane or Seattle or counties like King County. You also see smaller cities that have open data portals, cities like Camas or Port Angeles. And what you don't see here is all of this open data that is released simply by posting it to a web page on a county or city or department website, which is how a lot of open data is released. And whether they're released in a nice looking portal that has kind of uniform interface or they're posted on a web page, you're going to find data sets of, with a wide range of quality and documentation. So I'm just going to show you, walk you through one data set and one portal. So this is the City of Seattle's open data portal. And I want to look for library data. So I can either type library here into the search box, or I might scroll down and look at their publishing departments. And here is Seattle Public Library. So I'm going to click on that. And that brings me to a results page, and you can see I get a little view into each result, gives me title and when it was last updated and other types of information. And I can do a little filtering here by relevance or date. And I also have some options to filter here on the left-hand side. So I just want to look at data sets. I don't want somebody's chart or a map or anything. So I'm going to scroll down and look at checkouts by title. Okay, so here I've got checkouts by title. I've got a little description of what this data is and some of that information from the results page. And now I scroll down and I start to see some metadata. And because this has been carefully and lovingly prepared by the Seattle Public Library, all of this metadata is filled out beautifully. So sometimes when you come down to a description of what these column names mean or what these fields are, there is nothing here and you're just left in the dark. But a library has prepared this and we know what all of these terms mean. So if I'm just browsing, I might come down here and look at this table preview, and that starts to look more like a spreadsheet, and I can kind of start to figure out, oh, this is what they're telling me. And if I just want to play with it a little bit, I can even go to some visualization tools that they have baked into the website. But maybe I'm pretty familiar with data handling and I just want to grab this data and then export it to my own machine and work with it the way I want to work with it. And you can see I have lots of options for doing that. And if I'm a developer, here's an API that I can use for the app I'm developing. So that is a little look. If you've never been on a portal, that's what it looks like. Okay, so that's what it looks like at the source. What is it? What do people use open data for? So one thing people use open data for is just to tell a story, to showcase something in particular, and often that boils down to showcasing a region or a sector or issue. So here is an example of how people use data to tell a story about a region. This is one of the community indicators sites that is created by Eastern Washington University. They've done about 8 of these around Washington State, and they've been doing them for more than 10 years. So let's just take a quick look at this site. So here we are, Northeast Washington trends covering Ferry, Pend Oreille, and Stevens counties in Washington State. And this is pretty typical of the gateway page for a community indicator site. You see a picture, you get a little bit of description of what this is all about, and these lovely icons for various indicators that you can explore. So I want to explore the environment. And that takes me again to another kind of page that, notice how terrific the navigation is. I always have these icons up here, that menu, and I want to look at water quality, and that opens into a list of these indicators, list of this collection. And I'm going to look at Columbia River heavy metal exceedances. And when I click that, again, still having all these menus available to me, I get this interactive visualization. And I can play with that here if I want to, but maybe I just am wondering, well, where did this all come from? What are they showing me? So I can click on this tab and I get a nice, succinct, plain language description of what this indicator is all about and how it might relate to other indicators. And there's a link to the data source at the bottom of the page. So I can click on that and go straight to the data source and the publisher, or I can just download that data to my machine. And now I'm ready to work with it to my heart's content. So these are beautifully curated websites that pull together a lot of data that they haven't generated, but they have found it and pulled it together to showcase a particular region. And you can imagine how useful that is for people who live in the region or people who are interested in that region for any reason, like investing or moving there. Oops. All right, so that's showcasing a region. Another thing that people can do with open data that's available to them is they can showcase a sector or an issue. So this is the open data portal for the Association of Washington Cities. I'm just going to show you how they use data. So again, they are not generating their own data, they're pulling data from other sources, but they're using that to showcase issues that affect Washington cities. And you can either go to categories, as you could with the community indicator sites, but they're also doing something here at the top where they're using data to tell a story about an issue that particularly affects cities. So let's look at homelessness. And they have this scrolling multimedia interface. You've probably seen this if you read just about any news organization. And you can see it combines text and photos and data visualizations. And if you look even more closely, you'll see that this is data coming from places like HUD or the Washington Department of Commerce or the US Census Bureau. So again, this is data here with Association of Washington Cities and with the community indicator sites that is coming largely from federal and state sources, and they're able to pull that together to show you something about a particular issue or region. So government data can be used by everyone to tell a story about something in particular, but the government agencies themselves can also use data to improve their own services. So here's an example from Chicago. Chicago has more than 15,000 restaurants, and it has about 3 dozen food safety inspectors. So they are really spread pretty thin. And the Department of Public Health realized that it could combine data from sanitation inspections and complaints and business characteristics and other sources and optimize its food safety inspection. And as a result, they believe that they are catching more serious food safety violations more quickly. And I think on this site, they say it's something like, a week more quickly than they would have otherwise. So there are lots and lots of open data success stories that are like this one. So what happens is that a city or a region decides to prioritize open data, and all of this data and information that's been siloed in various agencies is now suddenly visible to everyone, and they can use predictive analytics to streamline their services and respond to situations more effectively. And this is another example of just that kind of success story. This is an example from the California Office of Emergency Services, and it was used in a presentation to Washington state agencies a few weeks ago on how they can use geospatial data, so GIS, to respond more effectively. So in this case, the Office of Emergency Services is able to respond to something like an earthquake or, for example, wildfires more effectively because they can map everything in real time. So in this ops center, they can see where a wildfire is, but they can overlay that with data from recent home inspections that tell them how at risk a particular structure is. Does it have lots of tree debris on the roof? Is there lots of vegetation close by? That sort of thing. And that helps the agencies to make better informed decisions about where to direct their efforts. And finally, we have innovation and entrepreneurship. So remember, open data can be used by anyone for any purpose, and that includes business and developing apps. So here are a couple of examples of mobile apps that draw heavily on open government data. WalkScore is an app that rates neighborhoods for walkability and bikeability, and it does that drawing on US Geological Survey data as well as US Census data. And if you live in the Seattle area, you might have used One Bus Away, which draws on Sound Transit's open transit data and helps commuters understand what wait times will be for public transit and otherwise aids them. So I hope those examples give you a better idea of what open data looks like in the wild. And I've chosen examples that showcase the three benefits that are commonly associated with open government data. So it starts with transparency, and that starts with the open data portals. The government is making available to its public information about itself and its services. Second is public sector efficiency and effectiveness. And finally, innovation and entrepreneurship. So remember, data.gov, the federal government data portal, is just shy of 10 years old. So we have a relatively new information source that really has heaps of potential, and potential that's already being realized. But it's a source that a lot of the public still doesn't really know about, doesn't know how to find it, doesn't know how to use it. So just to say that one more time, we have a relatively new information source with lots of potential and lots of potential benefit, but that the public still needs some help accessing and using. So what institution helps people access and use information? Ta-da! So we arrive at the library portion of our webinar, and this is what we're going to spend the bulk of our time talking about. So libraries help people access and use information, and I hope that it's not hard for you to see how open data fits snugly into the library's mission to empower people with information that helps improve their lives. And open data can really be seen very easily as an extension of traditional library areas of service. And indeed, a lot of librarians who have gotten into open data have come from these areas. So not hard to see how open data is an extension of government documents. Certainly it's another collection item that can help with reference service, and you can even connect it to makerspace, because open data is a relatively raw source that people use to make things like maps and charts and other visualizations. So I'm going to spend most of the rest of our time talking about what libraries are doing with open data. And again, I'm going to focus on these three roles that I mentioned earlier. So publishing open data, libraries publishing open data about themselves, instruction in all of its many forms, and advising government on publishing its open data or improving its open data. And I'm going to take those one at a time. As I talk about each of those areas, I'm going to be describing things that librarians have said. And there I'm referring to some research that I started earlier this year when I interviewed librarians or gathered information from almost 24 public library systems, mostly in Washington State, a few in California, and ranging from, Seattle Public Library down to libraries that are 5,000, patrons of 5,000 and under. So I tried to make sure I got libraries of various sizes. At the same time, I also surveyed all 39 Washington State counties and the largest city in each county to see who was publishing open data. All right, so let's start with libraries as publishers. In Washington State, I am only aware of Seattle Public Library publishing open data about itself. And that we saw one of those data sets at the very beginning when I walked through the Seattle Open Data Portal. There are public libraries publishing open data all across the United States and in Canada. And my friends at Open Data Literacy Project and I are working as fast as we can to try to document all of those and make a list of them. And I'll have a little list of the sorts of data they publish in just a moment, and there will be links to all of this at the end. So those are just a few of the public library systems that are publishing open data. State libraries, of course, publish public library statistics, and that's almost always in machine readable form. And IMLS has its own data portal where it houses a lot of those same library statistics along with data about state libraries and data about grant sources. Open Data Literacy Project has pulled together a list of the various kinds of data that libraries publish in open data portals around the United States and Canada, and that's a nice list for you. So you see some of that circulation data that we looked at earlier. You see everything from GIS of library branches and their service areas to cardholder activity to electricity usage at branches. All right, so why does it matter if libraries publish open data? Well, I would like you to think about 3 really good reasons for libraries to publish open data. And we'll just start with you're being transparent to your service community. So that's sort of an intrinsically good thing. The second reason that it's a good idea for libraries to publish open data is that it is a really good education in what open data is all about. You know, when you publish an open data set, no matter how modest you think it is, you are going to make lots of decisions and really understand what it is to be a steward of data and what it is to be a consumer of data, because you'll be thinking about those people who will consume this data. And libraries face all the same challenges that any open data publisher faces: constraints with time and staff capacity, concerns about privacy and security, and of course anxiety about what the public will think about this data. Will it be interpreted properly, or will it be misunderstood? And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few slides. And a third reason that it's great for libraries to publish open data about themselves is that it helps other libraries. So libraries across Washington State look at Seattle Public Library's data that they publish on the Seattle Open Data Portal. And that's useful if they're making acquisition decisions or trying to figure out if they need one more copy of something. But as one library director said to me a few weeks ago, you know, what's really particularly helpful is to see data from a library that looks like mine. So if you're a rural library with fewer than 5,000 patrons, it's helpful to see data from that kind of a library. And if you are a municipal library with 100,000 or fewer patrons, it's useful to see data from that kind of a library. So libraries publishing open data, it's a good thing. And if you are in Washington State and you are a library that would like to publish some open data, I have an offer for you, so stay tuned. Okay, so that is libraries publishing open data. And now we're going to turn to libraries teaching people how to find and use open data. And libraries teach open data to all kinds of audiences, including other librarians and other public agencies. And we'll get to that in just a few moments. But I want to start by just alerting you, if you are not already familiar with it, with them to 2 excellent open data curricula that have been developed in partnership with librarians. So in Washington State, we have Data Equity for Main Street, which is a Knight Foundation funded program. And in Washington State, it's been spearheaded by Will Saunders out of OCIO. And I think that they're up to just about 10 library systems now that have participated in that. And there are additional public libraries in California that are part of that program. So Data Equity for Main Street developed and pilot tested a 4-class curriculum in open data that assumes no previous experience and teaches people what open data is, where to find it, and how to use it. And that was developed largely by librarians. With there were a few other information and data professionals on that curriculum committee, but librarians developed it, librarians have pilot tested it, and it has gotten excellent positive reviews. And another terrific source of curriculum is Data 101 out of Western Pennsylvania, which was developed in partnership with the Carnegie Library of Pittsburgh. And again, that is a 4-class curriculum covering the basics, what open data is, how to find it, how to use it. And it has also been pilot tested extensively and gotten positive reviews. So I spoke to all the library systems, or got information from the library systems in Washington State and a few in California that have carried out this instruction with data equity. And we talked about things that went really well and things that could improve, and other things that I'm going to cover in the next few slides. So let's start with things that instructing librarians really liked about teaching open data. So definitely some very heartfelt statements about how open data connects to the library's core mission. So lots of talk about how open data is all about access and equal access, that teaching people about open data is a new literacy, that open data reinforces the kind of instruction libraries have always done when it comes to critical thinking and information literacy, and really how important it was to give the public equal access to this opportunity to participate in democracy and participate on their own terms, governed by their own interests. So that was a deeply important thing to the instructing librarians who have taught these classes and used this instruction. As I said, the curriculum has gotten overall very positive feedback. I think more than 3/4 of the participants said that they believed they would continue to use open data in their lives. And instructing librarians overall agreed that this is just good for strategic planning, that if you're a healthy, thriving library system, you're exploring tools like this and thinking about how they can benefit your users. When it came to classes for the general public, there were some challenges, starting with attendance and, of course, just meeting different skill levels and interests. And of course, that comes up in lots of classes and events that libraries convene. But in some cases, they had very healthy attendance, you know, a dozen or more participants and people coming consistently for 4 classes. But there were cases where they would get 1 or 2 participants, even after vigorous outreach. So that could be frustrating. Because of some of those challenges and meeting different skill levels and interests, some of the librarians who had conducted classes, the 4-part classes already, thought about, well, maybe in the future they would try one-time classes that were subject specific, like just focusing on property, or just focusing on crime, or just focusing on business development. Or some of them wondered if it might be more effective to provide just-in-time instruction. So when people come for Tech Tuesday drop-in hours, or if they have a question at the reference desk, that the librarians are prepared to offer open data and instruction in open data at that time. So I'm just going to talk a little bit more about that idea. That was a very popular idea, that reference librarians should be familiar with open data sources and be prepared to instruct patrons if they had a query that an open data source could help them with. So that led to more discussion about open data as a collection item. So what is its unique appeal? And these were the 3 things that came up the most. First of all, open data is the way to answer a question for which an answer doesn't already exist in some nice tertiary source. So if somebody comes in and has a very specific question and a very current question about their property or what's being done with property in their neighborhood, there's just not going to be a Gale virtual reference source for that. They're going to need to construct their own answer, and open data is a source that allows them to do that. Open data is another critical tool for information literacy and just vetting information for reliability. So remember, when we we're looking at some of those open data examples. We were looking at the Community Indicators website for Northeast counties in Washington State, and I could look at a chart, but if I wanted to know where the information for that chart or for the text came from, I could go straight to the source and I could look at that data and inspect it. And so that is just an extension of things that, of course, libraries have done since time immemorial. They teach people to how to verify information for reliability, and open data is another source that that they can connect patrons with for that purpose. But finally, of course, open data is very appealing to certain patrons at certain times, because the patrons themselves, the users themselves, are the ones that analyze and sort and interpret and visualize and shape the data. And that is exhilarating to certain users and overwhelming to other users. And perhaps a whole lot of people are in the middle, and it depends very much on the patron need, the type of patron, and the kind of support that they're getting. But open data training for librarians was a huge hit. So in many cases, the instructing librarians offered training to fellow librarians or invited librarians to come to the classes. And this got huge enthusiasm. So librarians came on their days off and they would come in packs, and then they would email each other about the visualizations they'd created and ask if there were going to be future classes, and they would tell other librarians about it. So there were a lot of informal signs of high enthusiasm and continued use, which probably doesn't surprise any librarians who are listening to this, because of course librarians use data to assess needs, use it to set priorities, use it to demonstrate performance. And so it probably won't be a shock to you that librarians quickly figured out how they could make internal use of open data. And there's just one example here on the right. This is a map generated by Phil Gunderson of the San Diego Public Library, who's a data equity librarian. And he generated this map of using census data of Arabic speakers in San Diego Public Library service areas. Okay, so we've talked about libraries as publishers of open data, libraries as instructors on open data, and now we turn to the advisory or consultant role. So when I started at the state library, and I talked to our state librarian, Cindy Aiden, about the work I would be doing, this was a role that particularly interested her. And one of the reasons that it particularly interests Cindy is the potential for open data to reduce the burden of public records requests on public agencies. So in Washington State, we have a vigorous public records Act, and that means that members of the public can request public records from public agencies, which is a wonderful thing in the public interest and often produces a lot of stress in public agencies. And you can imagine that as agencies get smaller and have reduced capacity, it's even higher stress. So so our state librarian is very interested in what effect better and more available open data might have on public records requests, and that was interesting to me too. But when I started, I wasn't quite sure what I would find here. I mean, this seemed like the role that was the least connected to the traditional kind of library role, and I wasn't sure if I was going to hear a lot of interest. And of course, this turned out to be the role that libraries express the most interest in. So in Washington State, we have 3 public library systems that are working as partners with local governments in their areas to launch or improve open data portals. And these efforts are still under development, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about them just yet. But in general, this advising role can look like anything from offering some suggestions to actually hosting an open data portal, which a few libraries are doing in the United States. And we'll look at some examples of them in a moment. When I talk about libraries in Washington State that are in this advisory role, I mean, to give you a sense of what they're doing things like helping to lead an open data champions committee. They're using some of that data equity curriculum to train government agencies about what open data is and how it can be used and how it can benefit them and their public. They are talking through anxieties about open data, drawing on their experience as open information ambassadors. And they're also conducting user research about who the likely users of open data are going to be and what kind of data they really want. So here you see, this is a screenshot from Chattanooga Public Library. This is one of those libraries that actually hosts an open data portal. Another is the Chapel Hill, North Carolina Public Library. Again, I'm keeping a list along with my friends at Open Data Literacy Project at UW, and we're keeping a list of these various partnerships across the US and Canada as fast as we can. But even so, that list is there's not much more than, say, a dozen libraries, maybe a little bit more. So having 3 library systems in Washington State that are working as partners is really pretty encouraging. So when I talk to libraries in Washington and California that have had this advisory or consulting role, these were some of the qualities that came up. And like, why did they turn to the library? Well, these are the reasons why they turned to the library. So publishing open data requires, or should require, first and foremost, just thinking about who the users will be and what kind of data they want. And this is something that libraries are extremely experienced in. Libraries work with the public every day. Collection development is all about thinking about potential users and what their desires will be. And libraries are very familiar with how real people really use information, particularly information online. So that is invaluable as people develop open data publishing portals. As Will Saunders likes to say when he talks to people about why it's great to bring libraries into the process, librarians speak IT, but they also like to talk to people, and they're a great bridge between technology and human beings. As I mentioned earlier, with all of that library enthusiasm for open data, libraries have long needed to justify what they do to their public and to funders, and they use data to do that. So libraries use data to assess needs, to set priorities, to demonstrate value. And so when it comes time for other agencies to publish data about themselves, they are really good at showing how that data can be used to demonstrate that you're doing what the public wants you to do. As I mentioned earlier, after time and capacity, the number one concern that government agencies often have when they're getting ready to publish data is concerns about misinterpretation. What will the public think about this data when we make it available to everybody and make it easy to get to? And libraries are just terrific ambassadors for open information culture, for saying things like, if you properly fill out your metadata and document this data, you are reducing the chances for misinterpretation. You're putting that data in context. Maybe if you feel like people won't understand this information, you need to publish more information. Maybe you need to provide a complementary data set. And they're also really good at saying things like, you know, if the public contacts you with a complaint, remember that the public is starting a conversation with you and that that's a good thing. Libraries are really good at that, and they're good at teaching other people how to respond in that productive, open way. And finally, of course, librarians are seasoned curators. So This is what libraries do. They use information quality standards to choose and organize and weed information so that it can be found and it can be used. So these are the qualities that the libraries who work with their local governments, that seems to be what has brought their governments into partnership with them. And even though it's kind of early days, I mean, these partnerships really seem to be a huge win for everybody. So first and foremost for the public, which is getting more and better data more quickly. It is a win for the government agencies that are publishing data because it's taking a process that can often be pretty stressful and making it a little smoother. But importantly, it is a big win for libraries. As I've said in a number of presentations, of course, I already believe that libraries have value, and I'm sure that you do too. But this is very helpful for libraries to be working directly with other government agencies, sometimes those agencies that make funding decisions about the libraries, so that those agencies can experience that, that very high value directly. So libraries have the potential to expand, to really help and expand and improve the availability of open data, and particularly at the local level, because libraries tend to be local institutions. And there is a lot of room for expansion and improvement, at least in Washington State. So when I looked this summer for open data being published in counties and large cities, I did find open data being published at about 2/3 of the Washington counties, one way or the other, and a few of the larger cities. But that data was overwhelmingly GIS, so geospatial data of things, meaning districts, boundaries, roads, buildings, facilities, street lamps, fire hydrants, things like that. And that's wonderful. I mean, without that foundation, you can't have things like that op center at the California Emergency Services that we saw earlier. You have to have maps of things in order to start adding layers of activity or inspections, things like that. But that kind of data about activity, about public life, is sort of that's the holy grail. You know, that's where we really start to see the richness of public life. So things like building permits or crime or 911 calls or traffic flow. Those are things that really start to illuminate what is happening in a community. And as wonderful as it is to have federal and state data available, which is what the Association of Washington Cities or the Community Indicator sites draw on, we have to believe that there's going to be a kind of detail and richness at the local level that we're missing right now. So libraries can really play a significant role in improving that availability. And libraries also can really help to improve the portals that we already have and that are already have a lot of good data on them. But as I've heard Will Saunders say at a few presentations, there's a lot of good stuff on data.wa.gov. There's also some stuff that could probably be weeded. And librarians are experienced professionals at doing that. And likewise, I was talking to Joanne Markert last week, who provides GIS support services for the state and oversees the geospatial open data portal. And we were talking about, she said, there are some data sets that just aren't circulating that much. And, you know, it would be great to find out why that is. Is it because nobody's interested in them? Is it because the data isn't good quality? Or is it because people can't find it because it's not properly organized? Again, these are questions that librarians have lots of experience dealing with, and they can really be a big help to existing data portals. Okay, so that is all about open data and what libraries are doing with open data, and I hope now you are been duly persuaded that open data is very much in the public interest and your public's interest, and you're saying, Kathleen, how can I take a next step in open data at my library? So let's talk about a few ideas about how you can get started or take another step in open data, and then I will have slides and slides of resources for you. Okay, so first suggestion, if you're new to open data or if you just feel like you need to maybe fill in some gaps, is to just start reading through this curriculum. Again, I'm just showcasing these two sets of curriculum that I mentioned earlier, but reading through these curricula will do two things. The first is that it'll fill in any gaps. You can do it on your own time, and it will, both of these curricula are just full of links and sources and videos and tools and all kinds of things that are really handy. And as you move through the curriculum, I think you'll feel that you have your feet under you when it comes to open data. But of course, the second reason that I would love for you to read through this curriculum is because I'd like you to start thinking about using it, either with your public or with other librarians, or perhaps with some local government agencies in your area. And if you are interested in that, and you're in Washington State or even in California, please get in touch with me. I will be happy to put you in touch with librarians who have already used that curriculum. Okay, another idea. Create an open data collection. So create a library guide. Just pull together some open data that would be relevant to your users and put it in one place. Here are some tips for how to find some open data that's relevant to your region or your area. And you know, you can combine that with some links to curriculum as well as institutions or organizations that work in open data, so that, you know, patrons who are interested in open data know where to go, where they can meet other people who are interested in open data. And as I said earlier, you know, a really interesting idea is that, you know, open data can be a resource for reference librarians, but I think pulling together a collection and just knowing what open data is out there and relevant to your region is a important first step for doing that. And publish some data. Other libraries are doing it, you can do it too. And if you are a public library in Washington State and you would like to publish some open data about your library system, you can do that on the state open data portal, data.wa.gov, at no cost to the library, as long as you work with the state library doing that. So if that is something that interests you, and I hope it is, call me, and we will get you started and get some more data out there. So you can start helping your public and helping other libraries. And finally, keep an ear out or talk to your local government agencies about open data. Listen for any conversations where officers are feeling burdened by public records requests, or they just wish that they could maybe have a self-serve option for their public. Maybe there was a recent snowstorm or a flood, or maybe there's a slower moving issue that is causing agencies to wonder how they could maybe work together a little bit more efficiently. Or more effectively. That is a common way that that data success stories come up, is either natural disaster or slow-moving problem. And on a more positive note, maybe they're just looking for ways to showcase their performance to the public. And that is a common way that local governments in particular come to launch open data portals. They want to show the public that they are doing what the public wants them to do. And again, these are conversations, I can support you in these conversations, and I can put you in touch with other libraries that have been in that consulting or advisory role. So the next several slides, and these will be available, you know, on the Washington State Library First Tuesdays website. But these are just some sources that, you know, links to things that we've talked about, both government data portals and data about libraries or data hosted by libraries. Here are links to just a few of the libraries of data that's published by some of those libraries across the US and Canada. If you're interested in publishing some data, these are just a few links to pages that'll help you get started. OCIO has helpfully put together this page of, you know, kind of good starting points and data to consider. That is, oh, actually, I'm sorry, that's the next slide. This is just getting started with publishing data and a good checklist to go through and how you can use data.wa.gov and what the steps involve. And then Socrata and ArcGIS are proprietary. You know, they're companies that work with open government data, and they have extensive training sites. If you're in Washington State, you can contact me for an access code of Socrata. ArcGIS, you can sign up for a free account and just work your way through tutorials if you want to. There are some links to the curriculum. And then if you are talking to local agencies that are interested in publishing some open data, these are excellent sources, kind of going from succinct to, you know, rabbit hole. So OCIO has a terrific kind of one page just talking about the kind of data that tends to be most in demand. And community indicators about pages just have a terrific summary of their process, their community-centered process for selecting data that the public wants. And then as you get to Western Pennsylvania Regional Data Center and Sunlight Foundation, there you're just going to have these terrific hubs that pull together all kinds of models and tips and examples, and as much or as little as you want to investigate. And finally, there are just dozens and dozens of wonderful foundations and organizations and activist groups and businesses that are involved in open data, and lots of them have blogs and feeds. These are really dependable, reliable starting points. And so if you just kind of want to sign up for a newsletter or RSS or just follow something to start getting more familiar with open data, these are all terrific starting points. But you'll probably find others. But mostly just please take down my information, call me, email me with comments, with ideas, with suggestions. And if you're interested in taking a step on open data, I would love to work with you. Anyone have any questions?
So I don't see any questions. Oh wait, Mikkel has one. So how can one be assured that the accuracy of the data that's been uploaded onto the sites?
Yeah, how can one be assured of the accuracy of the data? Well, you can't. I mean, I guess that that is a terrific question. And it's a question that can be used when you are instructing people about open data. Part of it is, the short answer is that there's never an assurance that it's perfectly accurate information. And as anyone who has kept data, and probably all of us have kept data in some form, it's easy for things to get entered the wrong way. It's easy for things to be inconsistently documented. But one of the things that you teach people when you teach them about open data is kind of how to inspect for that. And one of the best things that good publishers do is they provide contact information and a way to get in touch, so that it's never just sort of the static thing, it's a dynamic thing. So there is no perfect assurance that the information is going to be perfectly accurate, but ideally what we're doing is teaching people, first of all, to publish accurate, excellent information, and we're teaching members of the public to inspect and ask questions. Does
Okay.
that answer your question?
I don't. Yes, yes.
Okay.
He says yes. So are
Mhm.
there any other questions for Kathleen or any other questions about open data? Okay. Well, Kathleen, I want to thank you for sharing. I loved how you said how would you look for open data in the wild. So, and her slides, there's lots of places to go to look. Those will be posted later today on the First Tuesdays archive page. So it looks like you could spend a whole afternoon just clicking and looking at really interesting things. Um, and loved how you explained how to use open data to facilitate libraries as connectors to information in their communities. That was great. Thank you so much.